In September of 1937, one of the greatest fantasy novels of all time was published. Titled The Hobbit, or There and Back Again, it quickly became a critical and financial hit and went on to win many awards. To this day, the book remains popular, and it is considered one of the best children's books of all time. It's also one of my personal favorite stories to date, which is why I was way more than excited to find out that Peter Jackson, who made the predecessor stories from The Lord of the Rings into movies, was in fact making The Hobbit. It took years for anything to happen, with director Guillermo del Toro on board to write and direct, and Jackson would produce. The Tolkien estate, however, basically put everything on hold for years, and eventually del Toro left the project. Finally, a confirmed release date in 2012 was established, and Jackson was on to direct a 2-part film series, which then turned into 3. I guess New Line really needs the money. The story of Bilbo Baggins and his journey to help the company of dwarves retake their home and treasure from a fire-breathing dragon has been adapted in cartoons, comic books, radio stations, and video games, but we have had yet to see a live-action version. But here it is, about 2 hours of movie featuring 25% of the actual story from the book. This is really going to be some work. Christmas is soon, and I've been making videos for quite a few days now. I'm Matt, and this is Blockbuster Bombshell. Since there are 3 parts of this story as movies, I'll be doing 3 parts of this video series, or at least the first 2 movies. So the movie takes place 60 years before the actual events of the Lord of the Rings trilogy timeline, which is odd because by the beginning of Fellowship of the Ring, Bilbo is 111 years old. That means by the beginning of this story, Bilbo is in his 50s. Perhaps he had a good reason to be sticking around at home all day. Anyway, the movie begins with a bit of backstory, featuring the history of a dwarf bloodline that owned a crap ton of gold and a tendency to be insanely greedy. Eventually, these dudes get so much gold that a dragon named Smaug shows up and takes their gold and their home from them, basically leaving them without a home and the city outside of it a burning wasteland. Of course, now we get to find out how this has anything to do with Bilbo, as Gandalf just seems to be randomly strolling by when Bilbo is out having a good old smoke.
Good morning.
Despite Bilbo disagreeing with the thought of leaving the peace of the Shire and his home, Gandalf decides to mark his house for a meeting with the dwarves anyway. They all show up a few at a time and raid the poor guy's fridge, right in the middle of his dinner. Jeez, these dwarves are really quite a pain. They all help themselves to Bilbo's food and pretty much trash the place, acting all silly and stuff. Eventually, their leader and heir to the Lonely Mountain, Thorin, shows up and shit gets serious. They sit down and talk about their plans to take back the mountain, when logically they consider what the hell 13 dwarves are going to even do about a giant fire-breathing lizard in the first place. They turn to Gandalf, assuming that such a powerful wizard has slain dragons before. And I mean, who can blame them? Sadly, Gandalf doesn't answer and the group goes nuts. So, logically, they hire Bilbo as a burglar because a thief of any kind is going to be enough to help them fight and eventually slay a dragon. Bilbo declines their quest, to which we get the sentimental scenes that help the hero realize that maybe getting out of the house for a while sounds much more exciting than doing the same boring crap every day. So, as you'd expect, Bilbo changes his mind and off they go. And after a few Lord of the Rings movie references later, we get to see the first relevant part of the film, the 3 trolls, who have stolen their ponies and plan on eating them. So, naturally, they send their greatest warrior in to retrieve them. Bilbo. I mean, yeah, the burglar is the best bet for this, right? Well, after failing to get the ponies, the dwarves eventually try to help, but end up captured in the process. Great plan, guys. Anyway, Bilbo actually manages to trick these three idiots into believing that the dwarves are infected with parasites, at least after a bit of convincing.
I've got parasites as big as my arm.
Mine are the biggest parasites. I've got huge parasites.
Then the Deus Ex Machina shows up to save the day just in time. Hooray for Gandalf! He exposes them to sunlight and they turn to stone. Then, like any good LARPer, RPG player, or Skyrim enthusiast who defeats large monsters and villains, you raid their stash, of course. They find a few badass swords that apparently have a reputation, such as Gandalf's sword aptly named Glamdring, the Foe Hammer, and Thorin's Orcrist, the Goblin Cleaver. Then Bilbo gets a letter opener that is seen throughout the rest of the Lord of the Rings and Hobbit movies. Later on, he gives it the name Sting, and when goblins and orcs are near, it sings Fields of Gold. After a few scenes featuring more Lord of the Rings references, we find out our heroes are being chased by orcs, led by a completely made-for-movie villain named Azog, the Defiler. In the book, Bilbo and company are actually chased around by goblins. But for the sake of tying in the movies, Jackson and his screenwriters have featured appendices from the end of The Return of the King. So all this is relevant, I guess. Anyway, Gandalf basically has to trick these racist dwarves to show up at Rivendell, the famed city of pretty much every damn Lord of the Rings film. So I guess that counts as a half reference, because it's actually in the book too. There's a bit of tension until Agent Smith offers food, to which they eventually comply. I mean, who wouldn't? They later find out that there's another way into the presumably sealed mountain, by way of a secret door that can only be accessed at one point in the entire season and is conveniently within the time they have to get there. Fantasy films, man. What can I say? Anyway, after an entire scene dedicated to more Lord of the Rings stuff featuring Christopher Lee reprising his role as a skeptical Saruman the White, the company leads out on their way towards their quest. They run into some brawling stone giants and amongst the chaos manage to stay together and alive long enough for Bilbo to almost leave for the Shire. There's a sentimental moment between him and, Stinky? I don't know, I haven't kept track of the names at all. Let's just call him Dwarf Number 7. Anyway, after Dwarf Number 7's speech, the dwarves are all thrown within the mountain via a trap and run into a city of goblins, where everyone but Bilbo is captured, and manages to screw that advantage up for himself almost a minute later. But then we get to the most important part of the movie, the encounter with the infamous Gollum, who manages to capture the random goblin that fell with Bilbo to eat. In the midst of the struggle, he drops the main problem from all the Lord of the Rings films to come.
The One Ring.
But of course, at this point, nobody knows that at all in this movie, so I'd like to assume that it's just some magic ring that can turn you invisible. Anyway, Bilbo takes the ring and is unsurprisingly confronted by Gollum, to which they play an intense game of riddles for Bilbo's life. Bilbo eventually defeats him with the most unfair and non-riddly question of them all.
What have I got in my pocket?
Wait, that's not a riddle, is it? Well, anyway, Gollum knows that the question isn't fair and so tries to get around it using his trusty ring, to which he can't find, and immediately assumes that Bilbo has it. And like any crack addict looking for his stolen stash, attacks Bilbo. Meanwhile, our dwarf buddies are confronted by Fat Bastard, who has managed to rule over hordes of little goblin people and plans to turn them over to Azog for the bounty placed on Thorin's head. Of course, conveniently, Gandalf knows where they are and shows up in the nick of time to help them escape. Back in the deep caverns of the mountains, Bilbo discovers that the ring can grant invisibility and escapes from Gollum. Of course, there is a moment where Bilbo could easily kill Gollum and spare him his life, as well as 3 other movies in the future, but we all know that Frodo does that like 70 years later, so no need. Bilbo moves on and meets up with the company, only to be cornered by Azog and his gang. to which they naturally climb up a tree and throw flaming pine cones at them. This doesn't make them go away, and so Thorin thinks he can fight them, which goes very wrong. Bilbo saves Thorin at the last second, and Gandalf has managed to call in a favor with his eagle buddies to get them off the cliff and into safety. Eventually they are dropped off at another dangerous looking cliff, but thankfully it's not too far away from their goal of reaching the Lonely Mountain. Thank God. There's also a moment between Thorin and Bilbo because throughout the movie Bilbo has given Thorin doubts. But since Bilbo saved his life, he deserves a big hug. We get a tease of the main villain of the trilogy and the movie ends. Honestly, is this movie perfect? No. It has its moments during all the Lord of the Rings reference scenes where it's like, yeah, we know, we've seen the other trilogy, can we just get to the point of this one first? Is this movie great? Maybe. Bilbo does go through a significant change and does actually show some development of his character. From the snobby hobbit that wanted to stay at home and smoke his pipe all day, to realizing what his quest means to the dwarves and ultimately feels like he can help. It may be a simple change, but it's significant enough for the character to progress in a way that makes you root for him and his friends by the end of the film. It makes you want to see more, and whether you like that or not will depend on the taste of your movie pacing style. Personally, I like this movie. And while I think it's the weakest of the trilogy, it's not really bad by any means. I mean, we have the nods to the other movies, and it does take some time to really get going because of it, but if you're a fan of the story, or of fantasy movies in general, then you'll probably like this film. As a regular film goer, it is very slow and might take some patience from people. But if you give it a little chance and put yourself in Bilbo's shoes, I really think that you might actually enjoy it. The funny thing about Bilbo as a character is that he's kind of like most of us. The textbook homebody who wants adventure but never really finds the opportunity to do so, until finally an opportunity finds him. And while at first he's scared, he finds the courage to take the first step, and the rest is history. That's all I got for part 1, folks. Stay tuned for part 2 next week as I talk about Desolation of Smaug. If you liked this video or agreed with me on some level, give the video a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe for more episodes to come. If you have any ideas for what other blockbuster movies you want me to talk about, or just general detailed opinions on why you loved or hated this movie, feel free to comment. Remember, you're only entitled to your opinion if you can express it in great detail. So have at it. All opinions are welcome. After all, it's just a movie. And until next time, I'm Matt, and this has been Blockbuster Bombshell.